The sun rose over the Hawaiian island of Oahu on the morning of December 7th, 1941, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a Sunday, and across the military installations scattered around Pearl Harbor, thousands of American servicemen were sleeping in. The battleships of the Pacific Fleet sat in orderly rows along what everyone called Battleship Row, their gray hulls gleaming in the early morning light. Nobody on those ships, nobody walking the decks or standing watch, had any idea that in less than 2 hours, their world would explode into chaos, and their lives would change forever. What happened that morning would kill more than 2,400 Americans, sink or damage 18 ships, destroy nearly 200 aircraft, and force the United States into the largest war in human history. This is the story of those 2 hours, and how they changed everything. To understand why Pearl Harbor happened, we need to go back a few years and look at the rising tensions between two nations that seemed destined for conflict. Japan and the United States had been on a collision course for decades, and by 1941, that collision was almost inevitable. Japan was an island nation with big ambitions and limited resources. The Japanese military had been expanding aggressively throughout Asia since the early 1930s, seizing territory in China, Indochina, and beyond. The goal was simple: create what Japanese leaders called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vast empire that would give Japan access to the oil, rubber, metal, and other resources it desperately needed. But there was a problem. The United States opposed this expansion and had been tightening economic sanctions against Japan for years. By the summer of 1941, America had frozen Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo that cut off 80% of Japan's oil supply. For a nation that imported 90% of its oil, this was an existential threat. The Japanese military faced a stark choice. They could either abandon their ambitions in Asia and submit to American pressure, or they could strike south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and other resource-rich territories. But any move south would bring them into direct conflict with American, British, and Dutch forces in the Pacific. Japanese military planners knew that the United States had far greater industrial capacity than Japan. In a long war, America would eventually overwhelm them through sheer production of ships, planes, and weapons. So, the strategy became clear. Japan needed to knock out the American Pacific Fleet in one devastating surprise attack, then quickly seize the territories it needed while America was reeling. By the time the United States recovered and rebuilt, Japan would control such a vast empire that negotiating a peace would be America's only realistic option. It was a gamble, a huge gamble, but to the Japanese military leadership, it seemed like the only path forward. The alternative was surrendering their imperial ambitions without a fight, and that was something they could not accept. The man who had planned this attack was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was in many ways an unlikely architect of war with America. He had studied at Harvard University in the 1920s and had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America well, perhaps better than any other senior Japanese officer. He had walked American streets, talked with American people, and seen American factories. He understood the enormous industrial might of the United States, and he had serious doubts about fighting such a powerful nation. Yamamoto reportedly told colleagues that in a war with America, Japan might do well for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. Yet, Yamamoto was also a naval officer sworn to serve his country, and when his government decided on war, he would do his duty. If Japan was going to fight America, Yamamoto believed, then the attack needed to be so overwhelming, so devastating, that it would give Japan the time it needed. The plan that emerged from his mind was revolutionary and dangerous. Yamamoto proposed sending a carrier strike force across the North Pacific to launch a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor, the home base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Aircraft carriers, launching planes to attack enemy fleets, was still a relatively new concept in naval warfare. Most admirals still believed that battleships were the ultimate weapon at sea. But Yamamoto had studied the potential of carrier-based aviation. He knew that planes could deliver devastating strikes from hundreds of miles away. The plan was audacious and risky. The Japanese fleet would need to cross thousands of miles of ocean undetected, refuel at sea in rough waters, and coordinate hundreds of aircraft in a complex attack on a heavily defended target. The margin for error was razor thin. If the Americans detected the approaching fleet, the attack would fail, and the Japanese carriers would be vulnerable to counterattack. But if it worked, if they achieved complete surprise, they could cripple the Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Throughout the spring and summer of 1941, Japanese pilots trained intensively for the attack. They practiced bombing runs, torpedo attacks, and dive bombing techniques. Special torpedoes were developed that could run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Intelligence officers gathered every scrap of information they could about the layout of the harbor, the positions of ships, the location of fuel tanks and repair facilities. Japanese diplomats in Honolulu sent coded messages back to Tokyo describing ship movements and routine schedules. The planners knew that American warships were usually in port on weekends. They knew that the Army Air Corps planes at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field were often parked close together to prevent sabotage. They knew about the coastal defenses, the radar stations, and the patrol patterns. Every detail mattered, because surprise was everything, could ruin the entire operation. But what nobody knew at that moment was that American codebreakers had been reading some of Japan's diplomatic messages for months. The U.S. had cracked a Japanese diplomatic code called Purple, and intelligence officers were intercepting and decoding messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world. These messages showed that relations between the two countries were deteriorating rapidly. They showed that Japan was preparing for possible military action. But the coded diplomatic traffic did not reveal the specific target or timing of any attack. Japanese military codes remained unbroken, and the attack plan was so closely guarded that even most Japanese diplomats had no idea it was coming. American intelligence knew that Japan might strike somewhere in the Pacific. But the focus was on Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. After all, Pearl Harbor was thousands of miles from Japan, defended by Army and Navy forces, and seemed like an unlikely target. In Washington, American officials watched the diplomatic situation with growing alarm, but also with a certain sense that they had time. Negotiations between the United States and Japan had been dragging on for months. Both sides made demands that the other could not accept. The Americans wanted Japan to withdraw from China and Indochina. The Japanese wanted the United States to lift the oil embargo and stop supporting China. Neither side was willing to compromise on these fundamental issues, but the talks continued. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Japanese envoys met repeatedly, exchanging proposals and counterproposals. To many observers in Washington, it seemed like these negotiations might drag on for months more before anything decisive happened. There was a sense that Japan was rattling its saber, but might ultimately back down when faced with American economic pressure and military might. That sense of having time would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese carrier strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, far to the north of Japan. The force was massive. 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soyu, Hiru, Shukaku, and Suikaku, carrying more than 400 aircraft. 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines accompanied them. 8 tankers came along to refuel the fleet at sea. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanded the strike force. Nagumo was a cautious, by-the-book officer, not naturally aggressive like some of his subordinates, but he understood his orders. The fleet was to sail across the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence, avoiding all shipping lanes, and approaching Hawaii from the north. If they were discovered before reaching the launch point, they were to abort the mission and return home. But if they remained undetected, they would launch their attack on the morning of December 7. The voyage across the North Pacific was tense and difficult. The fleet traveled through rough seas and thick fog, maintaining radio silence while radio operators listened anxiously for any sign that they had been detected. Sailors and pilots dealt with cold weather, rolling decks, and the constant stress of knowing that discovery could mean disaster. Refueling at sea in the rough waters of the Northern Pacific was a dangerous operation, with tankers and warships coming alongside each other while connected by fuel lines, all while heaving up and down in heavy swells. But the crews were well-trained and professional. They managed it. Day after day passed with no indication that the Americans had any idea a massive fleet was approaching. The wall of radio silence held. No patrol planes spotted them. No merchant ships crossed their path and reported their position. As the fleet drew closer to Hawaii, tension mounted. But so did confidence. They were going to achieve complete surprise. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, life went on as normal for the thousands of service members stationed around Oahu. Pearl Harbor was home to the Pacific Fleet, the most powerful American naval force in the region. 8 battleships formed the core of that fleet. The Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Oklahoma, Tennessee, California, Maryland, and West Virginia. These were massive ships, some displacing more than 30,000 tons. They bristled with 14-inch and 16-inch guns. In the thinking of most naval officers at the time, these battleships were the real power of the fleet. Aircraft carriers were useful for reconnaissance and providing air cover, but battleships were the ships that would decide a major naval battle. That thinking was about to be proved catastrophically wrong. Along with the battleships, dozens of other vessels crowded Pearl Harbor. Cruisers, destroyers, submarines, repair ships, and auxiliaries. On any given day, there might be 90 or more vessels in the harbor, making it one of the most concentrated displays of naval power anywhere in the world. The sight was impressive. All that steel and firepower gathered in one place. The Army was responsible for defending Oahu against air attack, and thousands of soldiers manned coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and several airfields scattered around the island. Hickam Field, right next to Pearl Harbor, was home to bombers and patrol aircraft. Wheeler Field, in the center of the island, housed Army fighter planes. Bellows Field on the windward coast had more fighters. The Navy had its own air station at Ford Island in the middle of Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of aircraft, fighters, bombers, and patrol planes sat at these bases. But on that Sunday morning in December, many of those planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, lined up in neat rows to make them easier to guard against sabotage. The concern about sabotage had been growing in the weeks before the attack. Hawaii had a large population of Japanese ancestry, and some officials worried about espionage or sabotage in the event of war with Japan. So the planes were grouped together, closely guarded, but also creating perfect targets for an air attack. Nobody considered that possibility seriously enough. Lieutenant General Walter Short commanded the Army forces in Hawaii. Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the Pacific Fleet. Both men were experienced professional officers who took their responsibilities seriously, but both were also laboring under certain assumptions that would prove deadly. They knew that war with Japan was possible, even likely. They had received warnings from Washington about the deteriorating diplomatic situation, but they believed that if Japan struck, the target would be somewhere in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies, not Hawaii. Pearl Harbor seemed too far away, too well defended, and too obvious a target. They also believed that they would receive warning of any approaching threat. The Navy had patrol aircraft that flew reconnaissance missions out to sea. The Army had new radar stations that could detect incoming aircraft. Submarine nets protected the harbor entrance. Surely, if a major Japanese force approached Hawaii, they would know about it in time to respond. That confidence, that sense of security, was about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. On Saturday, December 6, life in Hawaii was relaxed and normal. Sailors went ashore for liberty, crowding into the bars and restaurants of Honolulu, buying souvenirs, meeting girlfriends, enjoying the warm tropical evening. Officers attended parties and dinners. Admiral Kimmel hosted a gathering at his quarters. Movies played at base theaters. A Battle of the Bands competition took place at one of the hotels. Some sailors wrote letters home, telling families they would be home for Christmas, that everything was peaceful and quiet in Hawaii. One young sailor on the battleship Arizona, a kid from the Midwest who had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, wrote to his mother, describing how beautiful the Hawaiian sunsets were and how lucky he felt to be stationed in such a paradise. He would be dead before noon the next day, trapped below decks when his ship exploded and sank. He was not alone. Hundreds of men enjoyed what would be their last peaceful evening, completely unaware of what sunrise would bring. They laughed, they drank, they made plans for the future. They had no idea that time was running out. Time was running out, though nobody in Hawaii knew it. While Americans slept or enjoyed their Saturday evening, the Japanese strike force was closing in. By the evening of December 6, the carriers were about 500 miles north of Oahu, steaming south at high speed. The plan called for them to reach a launch point about 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor by dawn. From there, they would launch 2 waves of attack. The first wave would include more than 180 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters. The second wave would have another 170 aircraft. It was the largest carrier airstrike ever attempted, and it would hit Pearl Harbor like a tidal wave of steel and explosives. On the Japanese carriers, pilots attended final briefings, mechanics performed last-minute checks on aircraft, and ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. Everyone knew this was the moment they had trained for. Some wrote final letters home. Some prayed. Some simply tried to sleep, knowing they needed rest before the most important mission of their lives. The tension was unbearable for some. Sunday morning, December 7, began like many other Sunday mornings in Hawaii. The tropical sun rose around 6 in the morning, bathing the islands in warm golden light. Some sailors were already awake, preparing for morning watches or church services. Most were sleeping in, grateful for a rare opportunity to rest. On Ford Island in the middle of Pearl Harbor, a few early risers noticed it was an especially beautiful morning. The sky was clear, the water calm, a perfect Hawaiian Sunday. At 7 in the morning, the destroyer Ward, on patrol outside the harbor entrance, spotted something unusual. A small submarine, later identified as a Japanese midget sub, was attempting to sneak into the harbor. The Ward attacked, dropping depth charges and firing its deck gun. The submarine was hit and sank. The Ward immediately reported the attack to headquarters. This should have been a clear warning that something was wrong, that Japanese forces were in the area. But the report got tangled in communication delays and skepticism. Some officers wondered if the Ward had really sunk a sub, or had just attacked a whale or some underwater debris. The report did not trigger the alarm response it should have. At the same time, something else was happening that should have provided warning. The Army had set up new radar stations around Oahu to detect incoming aircraft. These were cutting-edge technology for the time, huge antennas that could pick up reflections from metal objects in the sky. On the morning of December 7, two privates manning a mobile radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu picked up something extraordinary. It was a massive return on their scope, indicating a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, about 130 miles out. Private Joseph Lockhart and Private George Elliott were excited and a little nervous. This was the biggest reading they had ever seen. They called it in to the information center at Fort Shafter, expecting someone to take it seriously. But again, the warning did not produce the response it should have. The lieutenant who took their call assumed it was a flight of American B-17 bombers that were expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He told the radar operators not to worry about it and to shut down their station, as their shift was ending. The young privates did as they were told, but they kept the radar running out of curiosity, watching the blips get closer and closer. They tracked the formation all the way in, fascinated by the strong return signal, completely unaware that they were watching the approach of the largest air attack in history up to that point. If someone had listened, if the warning had been taken seriously, Pearl Harbor might have had precious minutes to prepare. What they were watching on their radar screen was the first wave of Japanese attackers. 183 aircraft arranged in carefully coordinated groups. 49 horizontal bombers, each carrying armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells. These were designed to punch through the thick steel decks of battleships. 51 dive bombers, carrying smaller bombs for attacking cruisers, destroyers, and shore installations. 40 torpedo bombers, each carrying a specially designed shallow-running torpedo that could work in Pearl Harbor's relatively shallow water, and 43 Zero fighters to shoot down any American planes that managed to get airborne and to strafe ground targets. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack. Fuchida was one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, handpicked for this crucial mission. As his formation approached Oahu, he looked down at the island spread out below and could not believe their luck. The morning was crystal clear. Visibility was perfect, and there was no sign that the Americans had any idea they were coming. He could see the harbor, the ships arranged in neat rows, the airfields with planes parked in the open. It was almost too good to be true. At 7:49 in the morning, Fuchida radioed back to the carriers the prearranged code, Tora Tora Tora, Tiger Tiger Tiger. It meant they had achieved complete surprise. 3 minutes later, at 7:52, the first bombs began to fall. The war had come to America. For most of the men at Pearl Harbor and the surrounding bases, the first indication something was wrong was the sound of explosions. Some thought it was another drill that the Army or Navy was conducting an unannounced exercise. After all, training exercises were common, and it was not unusual to hear explosions or gunfire from practice. But the explosions kept getting louder and closer, and then came something that nobody could mistake for a drill. The scream of diving aircraft, the chatter of machine guns, and the sight of planes bearing the red circle insignia of Japan. The Japanese attack was brilliantly coordinated. Different groups of aircraft hit different targets almost simultaneously. Torpedo bombers swept in low over the water, threading between the narrow entrance to the harbor and racing toward Battleship Row at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Flying at heights of just 50 to 100 feet above the water, the pilots lined up their approaches and released their torpedoes. These specially modified torpedoes ran shallow, just 35 to 40 feet deep, perfect for Pearl Harbor's waters. They struck the battleships below the waterline, where the ships were most vulnerable. Each torpedo carried hundreds of pounds of high explosives, and when they hit, they tore massive holes in the ship's hulls. Water rushed in, flooding compartments, pulling ships over to one side as their list increased. Sailors deep in the ship's interiors felt the shuddering impacts, heard the groaning of stressed metal, watched in horror as water began pouring in. For men trapped below decks, the realization hit fast. They were in danger, serious danger. Some tried to close watertight doors to contain the flooding. Others ran for ladders and hatches, trying to reach the main deck and safety. At the same time the torpedo bombers were attacking, high-altitude bombers were approaching from several thousand feet up. These planes carried the converted 16-inch naval shells, armor-piercing bombs that could penetrate the heavy deck armor of battleships. The bombardiers sighted carefully, releasing their deadly cargo at precisely calculated moments. The bombs fell in graceful, deadly arcs, accelerating to terminal velocity before smashing through steel decks. They exploded deep inside the ships, in engineering spaces, magazines, crew quarters, and dive bombers screamed down at steep angles, releasing their bombs at the last possible moment before pulling up. These attacks targeted not just the battleships, but also the cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels scattered throughout the harbor. Within minutes, the entire harbor was a scene of chaos and destruction. The battleship Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes in the first minutes of the attack. The explosions tore huge holes in her port side, and water rushed in with terrifying speed. The Oklahoma began to list heavily to port. Sailors tried to close watertight doors and shore up damaged areas, but the flooding was too severe, too fast. Within minutes, the list reached 20 degrees, then 30, then more. Men started to realize with horror that the ship was going to capsize. On a normal ship, you evacuate by going up ladders and through hatches to the main deck, then abandoning ship into the water. But as the Oklahoma rolled over, up became sideways and then down. Hatches that should have led to safety now led to the sea. Ladders became impossible to climb. Men scrambled through darkening passageways, water rising behind them, trying desperately to find a way out. Some made it. Many did not. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the Oklahoma rolled completely over, her hull rising out of the water as her superstructure smashed into the harbor bottom. 429 men went down with her. Some would survive for hours or even days, trapped in air pockets. The battleship West Virginia took multiple torpedo and bomb hits almost immediately. Massive fires erupted as fuel oil ignited. The ship began to settle into the mud, flooding but remaining upright. Sailors fought the fires and tried to seal flooded compartments. On the bridge, Captain Mervyn Benyon was severely wounded by shrapnel from a bomb that hit the nearby Tennessee. He refused to leave his post, continuing to give orders as his crew worked frantically. Benyon would die of his wounds, one of the senior officers killed that morning. His bravery earned him the Medal of Honor. But all across the ship, ordinary sailors were showing the same kind of courage, staying at their posts, manning guns, rescuing wounded shipmates, fighting fires even as bombs and bullets rained down around them. Heroes were being made in every compartment, on every deck. Then came the moment that defined Pearl Harbor, the moment that would be seared into American memory forever. The battleship Arizona was moored on Battleship Row, sailors rushing to battle stations as the attack developed. The ship took hits from several bombs, causing fires and damage, but nothing immediately catastrophic. Then, at 8:06 in the morning, a 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb struck near the ship's second turret. The bomb penetrated the deck and exploded in or near the forward magazine, the storage area where 1 million pounds of gunpowder and explosives were kept for the ship's main guns. What happened next was almost unimaginable. The entire forward part of the Arizona exploded in a massive fireball that shot hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion was so powerful that it was felt across the entire harbor. Sailors on other ships looked over in shock and horror to see a mushroom cloud rising from where the Arizona had been. The blast was so intense that it lifted the ship's 30,000-ton hull partially out of the water. The forward turrets, each weighing hundreds of tons, were thrown into the air. The explosion shattered windows miles away. Burning oil spread across the water, turning the surface into a sea of fire. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes, settling onto the harbor bottom with her superstructure still visible above the waterline. Of the 1,512 men aboard that morning, 1,177 died. Most were killed instantly in the explosion. Others were trapped below decks as the ship sank, drowning in darkness. Some jumped into the burning oil on the water and were consumed by fire. A few, incredibly, survived, pulled from the water by rescue boats or swimming through flames to reach safety. The death toll on the Arizona represented nearly half of all Americans killed at Pearl Harbor. It remains the greatest loss of life on any U.S. warship in history. Today, the Arizona lies where she sank, a tomb for the men who went down with her, and a memorial to all who died that day. But what nobody knew at that moment was that even as the Arizona burned and sank, even as the Oklahoma Lake capsized and the West Virginia settled into the mud, sailors and soldiers across the harbor were fighting back with desperate courage. The attack had achieved total surprise, but the response was anything but surrender. Anti-aircraft guns that should have been locked and secured for peacetime were torn open by crews using hacksaws and bolt cutters. Gunners grabbed ammunition from storage and began firing at the attacking planes. The response was chaotic at first, uncoordinated, but it grew stronger with every passing minute. Young sailors who had never fired a gun in anger found themselves manning machine guns, tracking fast-moving targets across the sky, squeezing triggers and watching tracers arc upward. Some hit their targets. Japanese planes started falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. Not many at first, but enough to show the attackers that they were in a fight. On Ford Island, in the middle of the harbor, the Naval Air Station became a target for dive bombers and strafing fighters. The American planes parked there, neatly lined up to prevent sabotage, were sitting ducks. Japanese fighters roared over at low altitude, machine guns blazing, tearing into the parked aircraft. Fuel tanks exploded, ammunition cooked off in the fires, mechanics and pilots ran for cover, then ran back out to try to save the planes or drag wounded men to safety. A few pilots managed to get to their aircraft, start engines and taxi toward the runway, desperate to get airborne and fight back. Most of those planes were shot up before they could take off, but a handful made it. These brave pilots, flying whatever planes they could get running, attacked the Japanese formations despite being vastly outnumbered. They knew they probably would not survive, but they went up anyway, firing their guns until they ran out of ammunition, then using their planes as weapons, trying to ram enemy aircraft. Some succeeded. Most died trying. But they proved that Americans would not go down without a fight. At Hickam Field, next to Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers and fighters attacked the parked aircraft and the base facilities. Hangars erupted in flames. The base theater, dining hall, and barracks all took hits. Soldiers ran from building to building, trying to help the wounded, set up defensive positions, anything to respond to the attack. At Wheeler Field, in the central part of Oahu, the story was similar. Japanese fighters strafed the neat rows of parked planes, destroying most of them before they could get off the ground. But some pilots reached their aircraft and fought back. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor were at Wheeler when the attack began. They raced to their P-40 Warhawk fighters, got them started, and took off into the middle of the attack. Welch and Taylor would shoot down multiple Japanese aircraft that morning, becoming two of the few American pilots to score victories during the attack. Both men would survive the war and become heroes, but on that morning, they were just two young guys doing what they could to fight back. Their courage inspired others and showed that Americans could hit back even when surprised and outnumbered. The first wave of attacks lasted about 30 minutes, though to the men under fire it felt like hours. Then there was a lull, a brief respite as the Japanese planes departed to return to their carriers. Across Pearl Harbor and the surrounding bases, men used that lull to rescue the wounded, fight fires, prepare defenses, and try to figure out what had just happened. The harbor was covered with a pall of thick black smoke from burning oil and ships. The water was full of debris, wreckage, and far too many bodies. Rescue boats were pulling men from the water, many of them burned, injured, or in shock. Medical personnel set up aid stations anywhere they could find space, treating hundreds of casualties with whatever supplies they had on hand. Everyone knew this was not over. If the Japanese sent one wave, they would likely send another. And they did. The second wave arrived around 8:54 in the morning. 170 aircraft, mostly dive bombers and fighters. The second wave did not achieve the same devastating surprise as the first. American defenses were now fully alert and firing. Every ship that could still shoot had guns manned and ammunition ready. But the Japanese pilots were professional and determined. They pressed home their attacks despite taking losses. Dive bombers screamed down on ships that were already damaged, adding to the destruction. Fighters strafed anything that moved. The battleship Nevada, damaged in the first attack, tried to get underway, to escape the harbor and reach open water, where she could maneuver and fight more effectively. It was a brave attempt, but as Nevada steamed toward the harbor entrance, she became a magnet for Japanese attackers. Multiple dive bombers hit her with bombs, starting fires and causing more flooding. The harbor control officers, worried that Nevada might sink in the narrow harbor entrance and block it completely, signaled her to run aground. The captain beached Nevada on the shore, preventing her from sinking in deep water. By the time the second wave departed, around 9:45 in the morning, the damage was catastrophic. 8 battleships had been hit. The Arizona was destroyed, blown apart and sunk. The Oklahoma had capsized. The California and West Virginia had sunk at their moorings, settling into the shallow water with parts of their superstructures still visible. The Nevada was beached and burning. The Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania were damaged but would survive to fight again. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and several smaller vessels were sunk or damaged. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground or in the air. Another 159 were damaged. Hangars, repair facilities, fuel storage tanks, and base infrastructure had taken hits. And most devastating of all, 2,403 Americans were dead. Another 1,178 were wounded. The dead included sailors, soldiers, Marines, and civilians. Young men barely out of high school, career officers weeks from retirement, fathers, sons, brothers. All gone in 2 hours. The scale of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Nothing in American history had prepared the nation for this kind of sudden, violent loss. What happened next would shock the entire nation and change the course of history. News of the attack spread quickly. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with bulletins about the attack. Americans across the country, sitting down to Sunday lunch or getting ready for church, heard the news and could not believe it. An attack on American soil, on American military forces, with thousands dead. It seemed impossible. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was informed shortly after the attack began. He was meeting with advisor Harry Hopkins when the phone call came through. Roosevelt immediately began coordinating the American response, contacting military leaders, drafting messages, preparing for what everyone knew would come next. America was going to war. The question was not if, but when and how. The following day, Monday, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. The speech would become one of the most famous in American history. Roosevelt began with words that would echo through the decades. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. The casualties and the other Japanese offensives that had been launched simultaneously against American and Allied forces across the Pacific. Then he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. In the Senate, 82-0. In the House, 388-1, with only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana casting a dissenting vote. Rankin was a committed pacifist who had also voted against entry into World War I. She believed that war was never the answer, and she stuck to her principles, even when it made her deeply unpopular. But the overwhelming majority of Congress and the American people supported war. America was at war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a two-ocean war against three major powers. The isolationism that had characterized American foreign policy through the 1930s evaporated overnight. Young men lined up at recruiting stations by the hundreds of thousands, eager to avenge Pearl Harbor. Industries shifted to war production. The entire nation mobilized in ways that would have been unthinkable just days before. But the story of Pearl Harbor is not just about the attack itself. It is also about what happened afterward, about the men trapped in the wreckage, about the rescue efforts, and about the slow, painful process of salvage and recovery. In the hours and days after the attack, rescue crews worked around the clock to find survivors. The most dramatic rescue involved the battleship Oklahoma. Rescue workers could hear men pounding on the hull from inside the capsized ship. Using cutting torches, they slowly cut through the thick steel, working carefully to avoid causing sparks that might ignite fuel or oxygen that could kill the trapped men. It was agonizingly slow work. Some men were rescued within hours. Others were trapped for more than 30 hours before being freed. 32 men were eventually cut out of the Oklahoma's hull alive, an incredible feat of rescue work. But 429 others died in the ship, and the sound of those desperate men pounding on the steel, the sound that grew weaker and then stopped, would haunt the rescuers forever. They did everything they could, but they could not save everyone. The Arizona presented a different kind of horror. The ship was gone, destroyed so completely that salvage was impossible. Oil continued to leak from the wreckage, rising to the surface and creating a rainbow sheen on the water. Bodies floated up from the wreck for days. Navy divers went down into the shattered hull, searching for any possible survivors, recovering what bodies they could. But the destruction was so complete that many men were never recovered. They remain entombed in the Arizona to this day. The ship was left where she sank, and later a memorial was built over the wreck. If you visit Pearl Harbor today, you can see the Arizona Memorial, a white structure spanning the sunken battleship. You can look down into the water and see the outline of the hull. You can see the names of the dead inscribed on marble walls, and you can still see drops of oil rising from the wreck. 80 years later, what some call the tears of the Arizona. The salvage effort for the other ships was massive and took years. The Oklahoma, capsized and resting on the harbor bottom, was eventually righted through an incredible engineering effort involving winches, cables, and pontoons. It took months of careful work, but they got her upright. However, the damage was so severe that she was never recommissioned. The hulk was eventually sold for scrap, but ironically, she sank during a storm while being towed to the scrapyard and now rests at the bottom of the ocean. The California and West Virginia, sunk at their moorings, were raised, repaired, and returned to service. Both ships would go on to fight in the Pacific, participating in battles against the very nation that sank them. The Nevada, beached during the attack, was refloated, repaired, and also returned to service. She would fight at Normandy, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, and would survive to be used as a target ship in atomic bomb tests after the war. The ship proved nearly indestructible. The human cost of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the 2,403 dead. The wounded faced long recoveries, many dealing with severe burns, shrapnel wounds, or traumatic injuries. Some would never fully recover. The psychological impact was profound. Men who survived the attack often suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1941 it was not well understood or recognized. They had nightmares about the attack. Flashbacks triggered by loud noises or the smell of fuel oil. Some struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many friends died. The attack also affected the families of those who died. Gold Star mothers and widows who lost sons and husbands, children who lost fathers. The pain rippled out through communities across America. Pearl Harbor also had a dark consequence that America would later recognize as one of its greatest mistakes. In the fear and anger that followed the attack, suspicion fell on Japanese Americans, particularly those living on the West Coast. Despite the fact that there was no evidence of sabotage or espionage by Japanese Americans during the attack, despite the fact that many were loyal citizens, the government decided to take drastic action. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced relocation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast to internment camps inland. Over the next several months, more than 120,000 people of Japanese descent, two-thirds of them American citizens, were forced to leave their homes, businesses, and communities. They were sent to camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. They were held there for years without trial or due process. It was a gross violation of civil liberties, driven by wartime fear and racial prejudice. Decades later, the U.S. government formally apologized and provided reparations to survivors, acknowledging that the internment was unjust. But it remains a sobering reminder that even democracies can commit serious wrongs when gripped by fear. Could Pearl Harbor have been prevented? That question has been debated for more than 80 years. In the aftermath, there was anger and a desire to find scapegoats. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders in Hawaii, were relieved of their duties and became the focus of blame. Multiple investigations examined whether they had failed in their responsibilities, whether they had ignored warnings, whether they had been negligent. The truth is more complicated. Kimmel and Short made decisions based on the information they had and the assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time. They did not expect an attack on Pearl Harbor, because most experts did not think Japan would or could launch such an attack. They focused on sabotage because that seemed like the more immediate threat. They did not have clear intelligence about Japanese intentions. In hindsight, we can see mistakes and missed opportunities. The report from the ward about sinking a submarine should have triggered immediate alert. The radar detection of incoming aircraft should have been taken more seriously. But hindsight is always clearer than real-time decision-making in a crisis. The commanders made the best decisions they could with the information available to them at the time. Some conspiracy theorists have suggested that President Roosevelt knew about the attack in advance and let it happen to bring America into the war. This theory has been thoroughly debunked by historians. While it is true that Roosevelt and his advisors knew that war with Japan was likely, and while they knew Japan might strike somewhere in the Pacific, there is no credible evidence they knew Pearl Harbor would be attacked. The intercepted diplomatic messages showed deteriorating relations but not specific military plans. If Roosevelt had known, it would have required him to keep an incredibly dangerous secret, to sacrifice thousands of American lives and a significant portion of the Pacific Fleet, and to trust that Japan would attack in a way that could be spun politically. It makes no sense. The reality is simpler and more tragic. Pearl Harbor succeeded because Japan achieved surprise through careful planning, operational security, and a willingness to take a huge risk. America failed to prevent it because of a combination of insufficient intelligence, flawed assumptions, and plain bad luck. Sometimes in history, things go wrong not because of conspiracy or malice, but because humans make mistakes and unexpected things happen. The strategic impact of Pearl Harbor was profound, but not what the Japanese expected. Admiral Yamamoto's plan had been to cripple the Pacific Fleet and buy time for Japan to seize territory and consolidate its position. The attack certainly damaged the fleet. 8 battleships hit, several sunk, would take time to replace or repair, but the attack missed some crucial targets. The Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were not in port that day. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea or on the West Coast. Those carriers would become the backbone of the American counterattack in the Pacific. The Japanese also failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, which held millions of gallons of oil, or the repair facilities which would be crucial for getting damaged ships back into service. If the Japanese had launched a third wave targeting those installations, they could have forced the fleet to withdraw. But Nagumo, cautious and concerned about American carriers that might be nearby, decided against a third wave and withdrew. It was a decision that Japanese planners would regret. More importantly, Pearl Harbor had an effect on American morale and determination that the Japanese completely miscalculated. Yamamoto had warned his superiors that attacking America was dangerous, that Americans would not simply negotiate after being hit. He was right. Other than demoralizing America, Pearl Harbor enraged it. The surprise attack, seen as a treacherous act of aggression, unified the country in a way that nothing else could have. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry. Young men who might never have volunteered rushed to join the military. Workers put in extra hours in factories to produce weapons and equipment. The entire nation committed itself to total victory. Japan had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, as Yamamoto allegedly said, and that giant was furious. The very attack meant to keep America out of the war guaranteed that America would fight with every resource at its disposal until Japan was utterly defeated. The battles that followed Pearl Harbor would take place across the vast Pacific Ocean, on tiny islands, and in enormous carrier battles. The war in the Pacific would last nearly 4 more years and cost millions of lives. But the eventual outcome was never really in doubt after America fully committed its industrial and military might. At Pearl Harbor, Japan had sunk or damaged battleships. America built more. Japan had destroyed aircraft. America built thousands more. Japan had killed thousands of American servicemen. Millions more enlisted to take their place. The mathematical reality that Yamamoto understood from the beginning, that America's industrial capacity vastly exceeded Japan's, played out exactly as he feared. By 1945, Japan was facing invasion by an American military that had grown to millions of men, thousands of ships, and tens of thousands of aircraft. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August brought the war to an end. But Japan had been defeated long before that, worn down by the massive American military machine that Pearl Harbor had unleashed. Today, more than 80 years after the attack, Pearl Harbor remains a powerful symbol in American memory. It represents the cost of unpreparedness, the danger of surprise attack, and the resilience of people who respond to crisis with courage and determination. The attack killed 2,403 Americans in 2 hours. But it also revealed something important about the American character. When hit, Americans do not surrender. They get up, they rebuild, and they fight back. The sailors who manned guns despite being outnumbered, the pilots who flew against impossible odds, the rescue workers who cut through steel to save trapped men, all of them demonstrated courage in the face of overwhelming danger. Their actions that day set the tone for the entire war effort. The USS Arizona Memorial receives millions of visitors every year, people from around the world who come to pay their respects to the men who died there. The memorial is a place of quiet reflection, where visitors can contemplate the cost of war and the sacrifice made by those who serve. The names on the wall are not just statistics. They were real people. Young men like 19-year-old Seaman First Class William Manchester, who played saxophone in the ship's band and died when the Arizona exploded. Men like Captain Franklin von Valkenburg, who stayed at his post on the bridge directing the defense of his ship until the explosion killed him. Men like Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, who died alongside Van Valkenburg, refusing to leave when he could have sought safety. Every name represents a life cut short, a family forever changed, a future that never happened. That is what Pearl Harbor really means. Not just a military defeat or a historical event, but a deeply personal tragedy for thousands of families. The lessons of Pearl Harbor have shaped American military and foreign policy for decades. Never again would America be caught so completely off guard. The intelligence failures that allowed the attack led to major reforms in how America gathers, analyzes, and shares intelligence. The disaster proved the importance of aircraft carriers over battleships, transforming naval warfare forever. The attack demonstrated that distance and oceans no longer provided automatic security in an age of aircraft carriers and long-range bombers. These lessons influenced American strategy throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The attack also led to a more permanent American military presence around the world. Before Pearl Harbor, America had a small, peacetime military and generally avoided foreign entanglements. After Pearl Harbor, America maintained a large standing military and network of bases worldwide ready to respond to threats. Whether you think that is good or bad policy, it is a direct consequence of December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor also changed how Americans think about service and sacrifice. The generation that fought World War II came to be called the Greatest Generation, and Pearl Harbor was their baptism by fire. The young men and women who responded to the attack, who built the planes and ships, who fought the battles and won the war, created a legacy that still resonates today. They showed that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough. A kid from a farm in Iowa could become a hero on a burning battleship. A mechanic from New York could keep planes flying under enemy fire. A woman who had never worked outside the home could become a skilled welder building ships. Pearl Harbor and the war that followed proved that courage is not about being fearless. It is about being afraid but doing your duty anyway. It is about standing up when others fall. It is about refusing to quit even when the situation seems hopeless. For Japan, Pearl Harbor was the beginning of a catastrophic miscalculation that would end with the destruction of their empire and the occupation of their homeland. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. It brought America into the war, but did not cripple American ability to fight back. It bought Japan a few months of relatively unopposed expansion, but at the cost of awakening an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity and a burning desire for revenge. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway would destroy 4 Japanese carriers and kill many of the experienced pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor. Within a year, American forces would be on the offensive, taking back territory and advancing island by island toward Japan. Within 4 years, Japan would lie in ruins, its cities burned, its military destroyed, its government forced to surrender unconditionally. The path from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, where the surrender was signed, was paved with millions of deaths and unimaginable destruction. Pearl Harbor started that terrible journey. One of the most poignant aspects of Pearl Harbor's legacy is the reconciliation between America and Japan that occurred after the war. The two nations that fought such a bitter conflict became close allies. Japan rebuilt as a democracy with American help, transforming into an economic powerhouse. Veterans from both sides who had tried to kill each other at Pearl Harbor and in battles across the Pacific later met as old men. They shook hands, shared memories, even became friends. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, veterans from both countries gathered at the memorial for a ceremony of remembrance and reconciliation. It was a powerful moment, former enemies standing together, acknowledging the pain of the past while celebrating peace in the present. That reconciliation does not erase what happened at Pearl Harbor. It does not bring back the dead or heal all wounds, but it does show that even the deepest hatreds can eventually give way to understanding and friendship. The human stories from Pearl Harbor continue to emerge even decades later. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have allowed the military to identify remains recovered from the harbor and return them to families for burial. Sailors who were listed as unknown for decades are finally getting their names back and proper burials with their families. Present, it is a reminder that the work of honoring those who died at Pearl Harbor continues, that the nation has not forgotten them. Every time a Pearl Harbor survivor passes away, and fewer than a dozen are still alive as of 2025, it is a reminder that we are losing the direct connection to that day. Soon, Pearl Harbor will be entirely a matter of history, not living memory. That makes it even more important to preserve the stories, to maintain the memorials, to teach new generations about what happened and why it matters. What would those young men who died at Pearl Harbor think if they could see America today? They died in an America that was still segregated, where women could not serve in combat roles. They died in an era before television, computers, or space travel. The world they knew is almost unrecognizable compared to today. But in some fundamental ways, the country they died for is still the same. America remains a nation that values freedom, that believes in defending itself and its allies, that honors those who serve in uniform. The men who died at Pearl Harbor were defending that America. And in a very real sense, we are all living in the world their sacrifice helped create. The freedom we enjoy, the security we sometimes take for granted, was paid for, in part, by their blood in the waters of Pearl Harbor. The legacy of Pearl Harbor extends beyond military history into American culture and identity. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became part of the American lexicon. A reminder to stay vigilant, to be prepared, to never forget those who died in service to their country. Pearl Harbor became a symbol of American resilience, the idea that America can take a devastating blow and come back stronger. It became a reference point for other national tragedies. After the September 11 terrorist attacks, many Americans drew parallels to Pearl Harbor, another surprise attack on American soil that killed thousands. Both events share similarities: the shock, the anger, the unity that followed, the sense that everything changed in a single morning. Both events also led to long wars and significant changes in American foreign and domestic policy, but Pearl Harbor also serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of war and the importance of diplomacy. The path to Pearl Harbor was paved with failures of communication, misunderstandings, and decisions that made conflict increasingly likely. Could the war have been avoided? Historians debate this question. Some argue that Japanese militarism and American opposition to Japanese expansion made conflict inevitable. Others suggest that with more flexible diplomacy on both sides, a compromise might have been possible. We will never know. What we do know is that once the bombs started falling on December 7, 1941, the die was cast. The war that followed would kill millions of people, reshape the world order, and have consequences that echo to this day. Pearl Harbor reminds us that wars are easy to start, but hard to stop, that the decision to fight should never be made lightly, and that the costs of war are always higher than anyone expects. For the survivors of Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, remained the defining day of their lives. Many of them rarely spoke about what they experienced, the memories too painful or too personal to share. But as they grew older, many felt a duty to tell their stories, to make sure that future generations understood what happened. They spoke at schools, at veteran events, at the memorial itself. They described what they saw, what they felt, how they responded. They talked about friends who died, about the fear and chaos, about the determination to survive and fight back. Their stories are invaluable primary sources, direct testimony from people who were there. As those voices fall silent, we rely on their recorded interviews, their written memoirs, and the physical evidence preserved at Pearl Harbor to keep the memory alive. The physical evidence is still there. If you visit Pearl Harbor today, you can see the sunken hull of the Arizona beneath the memorial. You can see the battleship Missouri, where Japan signed the surrender documents in 1945, now moored as a museum ship at Pearl Harbor. The juxtaposition is powerful. The ship where the war began in the Pacific, and the ship where it ended, side by side. You can visit the Pacific Aviation Museum, built in hangars that were attacked on December 7, where bullet holes from Japanese machine guns are still visible in the walls. You can see the submarine USS Bowfin, which was launched exactly 1 year after the attack and fought throughout the Pacific War. All of these sites help tell the story of Pearl Harbor and the war that followed. They make history tangible, real, not just dates and names in a book, but actual places where actual events happened. The debate over how to remember and interpret Pearl Harbor continues. Some see it primarily as a story of military failure, focusing on the intelligence breakdowns and command decisions that allowed the attack to succeed. Others see it as a story of heroism, highlighting the courage of individuals who responded to the crisis. Some view it through the lens of international relations, analyzing the diplomatic failures that led to war. Others focus on the human cost, the personal stories of loss and grief. All of these perspectives have value. Pearl Harbor was complex, involving politics, military strategy, individual decisions, random chance, and human emotion. No single interpretation captures everything. The best understanding comes from looking at it from multiple angles. One aspect of Pearl Harbor that deserves attention is the role of African American sailors during the attack. The Navy in 1941 was segregated, and black sailors were generally restricted to serving as mess attendants, cooks, and stewards rather than in combat positions. Despite this discrimination, black sailors fought bravely during the attack. Doris Miller, a mess attendant on the West Virginia, manned an anti-aircraft gun despite never having been trained to use one. While he was at a Valavatnskag, he shot at attacking planes and helped carry wounded sailors to safety, including his mortally wounded captain. Miller became the first African American to receive the Navy Cross, and his actions at Pearl Harbor helped begin the slow process of desegregating the military. Stories like Miller's remind us that heroism knows no color, and that some of the men who defended America at Pearl Harbor returned home to a country that denied them basic civil rights. And That contradiction, Americans of all races fighting for freedom while many faced discrimination at home, is an important part of the Pearl Harbor story and the broader story of World War II. The technological lessons from Pearl Harbor also had lasting impact. The attack demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of carrier-based air power. Battleships, long considered the ultimate naval weapon, proved vulnerable to aircraft. This realization transformed naval warfare. After Pearl Harbor, aircraft carriers became the capital ships of fleets, and the era of the battleship as queen of the seas came to an end. The attack also highlighted the importance of radar, which had detected the incoming raid but was ignored. After Pearl Harbor, radar technology was rapidly improved and integrated into air defense systems. The attack showed the value of air superiority and the need for fighters to protect ground installations. All of these lessons influenced American military development throughout the war and beyond. Modern military doctrine, with its emphasis on air power, carriers, and integrated defense systems, traces directly back to lessons learned at Pearl Harbor. The economic impact of Pearl Harbor was immediate and enormous. American industry, still recovering from the Great Depression, shifted into high gear for war production. Factories that had made cars started making tanks and planes. Shipyards expanded massively to build the hundreds of vessels needed to replace losses and expand the fleet. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories, shipyards, and offices previously reserved for men. The famous Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of women's contributions to the war effort. The government imposed rationing on everything from gasoline to sugar to rubber, asking civilians to sacrifice for the war effort. People bought war bonds, collected scrap metal, planted victory gardens. The entire economy and society reorganized around winning the war. Pearl Harbor was the catalyst for this mobilization. Before December 7, America was providing aid to Britain, but trying to stay out of the fighting. After December 7, there was no half measures. It was total war, and America committed everything it had. The diplomatic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the United States and Japan. The attack brought America into World War II not just against Japan, but ultimately against Germany and Italy as well. This transformed the war. Britain, which had been fighting alone against Nazi Germany, now had a powerful ally. The Soviet Union, invaded by Germany in June 1941 and suffering catastrophic losses, gained an ally. America would provide massive material support through the Lend-Lease program. The combined might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union would eventually overwhelm the Axis powers, but it took years of hard fighting. Pearl Harbor set in motion a chain of events that led to D-Day, the liberation of Europe, the defeat of Nazi Germany, the atomic bombs on Japan, and the emergence of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers. The world we live in today, the international order, alliances, and conflicts, all trace back in some way to World War II and the attack that brought America into it. For the Japanese pilots and sailors who carried out the attack, Pearl Harbor was both a triumph and the beginning of tragedy. They had pulled off one of the most successful surprise attacks in military history. They had damaged or destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet. They had achieved their mission, but many of them would not survive the war. Some died in the Battle of Midway 6 months later. Others fell at Guadalcanal in the Marianas, in the Philippines, or in the skies over Japan itself. Commander Fuchida, who led the attack, survived the war and later became a Christian missionary, spending decades promoting peace and reconciliation between Japan and America. He wrote extensively about Pearl Harbor, providing the Japanese perspective on the attack. His story, like those of many Japanese veterans, is one of duty, courage, and eventual regret for the war and its consequences. Understanding the Japanese side of Pearl Harbor does not excuse the attack. but it helps us see the full picture of how and why it happened. The intelligence failures at Pearl Harbor led to the creation of more centralized intelligence agencies after the war. Before Pearl Harbor, intelligence gathering was fragmented across different military branches and government departments, with poor communication between them. Information that might have warned of the attack was scattered across different offices, analyzed by different people who did not talk to each other. After the war, this led to reforms aimed at centralizing and coordinating intelligence. The creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947 was partly a response to Pearl Harbor's lessons. The goal was to ensure that crucial intelligence would be collected, analyzed, and shared effectively so that America would never again be caught as completely off guard as it was on December 7, 1941. Whether these reforms succeeded is debatable. September 11 showed that even with centralized intelligence agencies, surprise attacks can still happen. But the attempt to learn from Pearl Harbor and prevent future disasters is part of the attack's lasting legacy. The memorialization of Pearl Harbor began almost immediately after the attack. The Arizona, too damaged to raise, became a tomb for the sailors who died there and a symbol of the attack. In the 1960s, a memorial was built over the wreck, designed by architect Alfred Price. The structure is white, spans the sunken ship without touching it, and includes a shrine room where the names of the dead are inscribed. The memorial's design is meant to evoke both sorrow and hope, with a sagging middle section representing the initial defeat and raised ends representing ultimate victory. The memorial became one of America's most visited national monuments, a place where millions come to remember, to reflect, and to honor the dead. For many veterans, visiting the memorial is an emotional experience, bringing back memories of that day and of the shipmates they lost. For younger Americans, it is an opportunity to connect with history and understand what previous generations sacrificed. The story of Pearl Harbor also includes the incredible salvage and recovery efforts that continued for years after the attack. Raising sunken ships, repairing damaged vessels, and clearing the harbor of wreckage was a massive undertaking. Navy salvage divers worked in dangerous conditions, entering flooded compartments, cutting through twisted metal, recovering bodies, and preparing ships to be raised. The California took nearly 6 months to raise and would spend 2 more years being repaired before returning to service. The West Virginia was raised in May 1942 and repaired by 1944. These ships, once left for dead at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, came back to fight and were present at the final battles of the Pacific War. There is something powerfully symbolic about that. The ships that Japan thought it had destroyed came back, rebuilt and stronger to participate in Japan's defeat. It mirrors the story of America itself after Pearl Harbor. Knocked down, but not knocked out. Hurt, but not defeated. Eventually coming back with overwhelming force. As we approach the 90th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the event remains relevant to contemporary America. The last survivors are in their late 90s and early hundreds, and soon there will be no one left. This transition from living memory to history is significant. When the last Pearl Harbor survivor passes away, the event will shift from something that real people experienced to something we know only through records, artifacts, and secondhand accounts. This makes it even more important to preserve the stories, maintain the memorials, and teach young people about Pearl Harbor. The lessons remain relevant. The importance of vigilance and preparedness, the danger of surprise attack, the resilience of people facing crisis, the courage of ordinary individuals doing extraordinary things, the costs of war and the value of peace. These lessons do not expire. They are as important today as they were in 1941. Pearl Harbor also reminds us of the importance of remembering and honoring those who serve in uniform. The 2,403 Americans who died on December 7 were doing their jobs, serving their country when they were killed. They did not choose to be at Pearl Harbor on that particular morning. They did not ask to become part of one of the most significant events in American history. They were simply doing their duty, and they paid for it with their lives. The least we can do is remember them, honor their service, and ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. Every name on the wall of the Arizona Memorial represents a life that mattered, a person who had hopes and dreams, family and friends. They deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, but as individuals who gave everything for their country. The attack on Pearl Harbor stands as one of the pivotal moments in American history. A day when everything changed, when America went from peace to war, from isolation to global engagement, from a relatively small military power to an arsenal of democracy that would help win the largest war in history. Those 2 hours on December 7, 1941, shaped the world we live in today. They tested America and proved that the nation could endure catastrophic loss and come back stronger. They revealed both the best and worst of human nature, the capacity for violence and destruction, but also for courage, sacrifice, and resilience. They remind us that freedom is not free, that security cannot be taken for granted, and that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The men who died at Pearl Harbor paid that price. We honor them by remembering their sacrifice and by defending the freedoms they died for. Their legacy lives on not just in memorials and history books, but in the America they helped preserve, the nation that rose from the ashes of that Sunday morning to become a beacon of hope and freedom for the world.